Okay, well, it looks like we've got everybody logged on here. We aren't seeing any changes right away. So I'm Jody Plummert, and John Gasper is here with me today, and this is the SaferSim Bootcamp webinar series, and today is week 2, and we are talking about experimental design and how to design an experiment. I'm having a little trouble getting this slide to advance.
You might have to click once in the corner, click on the slide.
Let me try down here. There we go. Let me try this. There we go. Okay, so we are on webinar 2, experimental design. And so today we just basically want to go over some of the good practices and steps and things to think about when you're designing an experiment that you're going to do in simulation. So step 1 is formulating a research question. This is something that Joe talked about last week, but we wanted to return to it again today just to make sure people are really thinking about this problem. So in this question of what are good questions for simulation, that largely revolves around the unique strengths of experimental control and participant safety that are possible with simulation. So when we talk about questions that allow you to identify causation or test dangerous situations or impaired states, measuring precise response times, creating repeatable scenarios, and estimating relative risk, those are all the kinds of things that you can do in simulation where you can have very tight experimental control over the situation, and you also can have people encounter situations that might be dangerous in the real world, but they can do so safely in simulation. Bad questions, again, for simulation are observing natural real-world behaviors, because why would you do this in simulation if you can do it out there in the real world? Measuring the prevalence of behavior is similar. Complex road environments are often very difficult to do in simulation, and also estimating absolute risk. So as Joe talked about last week, we can estimate relative risk in simulation. So for example, our work on children's road crossing, the age differences that we see between kids and adults are relative and we believe are real, even though they may be actually taking smaller gaps in the simulator than they would in the real world. So the absolute differences might not be there, but the relative differences are there. So the other thing to think about when you're designing your experiment and thinking about the research question is how do simulators constrain the questions that can be asked? And so, for example, turning in fixed space simulators is going to be a problem in terms of motion sickness. So you can't design an experiment or devise a research question that's going to require lots and lots of left turns from people or lots and lots of right turns, because people will get simulator sickness. Field of view is also an issue with simulators and will constrain the kinds of questions you can ask. So forward screen driving simulators make it difficult, for example, to look at gap acceptance in intersection crossing because you don't have enough field of view on both the left and right sides. Head-mounted display systems, as Joe talked about last time, are limited in their field of view. The amount of information or the amount of the visual field that you can see at any one time is constrained. So that may be an important consideration in designing your experiment. And again, this isn't to mean that you don't use these simulators, it's just that you want to devise questions that are actually going to fit with the simulation system. Range of walking motion in pedestrian simulators is important. So for example, in our cave setup, people can only walk 14 feet because they'll hit the front screen. And so you have to think about, well, what are the distances across the roadway that you want to study? And if those distances are bigger than you actually have in your pedestrian simulator, that's not going to work. And then another possibility in thinking about bicycling simulators is fatigue. So you have to think about how much bicycling you're going to have somebody do and they can't do more than they're actually going to be able to handle. So these are all physical aspects of simulators that will constrain the kinds of questions that you'll be able to ask. And that does not include the potential constraints that arise from the virtual nature of the experience, such as nothing happens to you if you get hit. Those are other kinds of considerations about simulation that might constrain the research question that you ask. So these research questions that you have will guide your decisions. So for example, will you rely on objective or subjective data or both to answer your question? So for example, sometimes you might want to supplement your simulator data with self-report surveys like personality measures, driving experience, bicycling experience. In our work, we find it useful to get information about people's bicycling experience or their pedestrian experience, just as a supplement to what we're doing in the simulator. And sometimes we can actually address interesting questions such as, does their performance in a bicycling simulator relate at all to the amount of experience that they have bicycling in the real world? Another type of research question would be, are you testing a specific hypothesis that's generated from previous research? So if you're doing this, you're going to want to be careful that you have all the necessary controls in place and that the data is comparable with previous research. So if you want to test a specific hypothesis from previous research, then you really want to make sure that your setup is exactly the same or as close as possible to the previous research, because otherwise it may be difficult to make comparisons across two very different kinds of scenarios or setups if you want to think about the new data in relation to the old data. And finally, are you conducting exploratory research on a new topic? This kind of research might require a lot of pilot testing to actually work out all the quirks. And so the kinds of decisions that you make about your study will be different if it's exploratory research than if it's following up on well-established research. Oh, and also I should say to people, please feel free to type in the chat box at any point if you have any questions or if anything's not working with the slideshow. Okay, so just to go over some basics about experimental design for people who may not be familiar with this or would like a refresher. The independent variables are the variables that are manipulated by the researcher. So this is why they're called independent, because these are the kinds of variables or factors that you are manipulating as the researcher. So what we call between subjects factors are those that are manipulated between separate groups of subjects. So this means that every condition contains a unique sample of participants. So if you're looking at how drowsy driving compares to normal driving, you would have one group that is drowsy and the other group that's not drowsy. And so each of those groups would likely be a unique sample of participants, so different people in those two conditions. You'll need at least 2 levels for each factor, but there could be more. And this, of course, whenever you're using a between subjects design, it's going to require a larger sample. So, for example, let's say that you decided you wanted to look at gender in addition to drowsiness in your study. Essentially, you would have to double your sample size because now you need a sample of female and male drowsy drivers, and you need a sample of female and male non-drowsy drivers. So you can kind of see with a between subjects design how you end up needing much larger samples. This kind of design will also increase the chance of extraneous variance or variance that you don't want or don't care about, especially if your groups are not well matched. So this is one of the reasons why We try to be very careful about random assignment to groups so that you don't bias your groups and have differences between your groups that could potentially make it difficult to interpret your results. So here's just an example of a potential between subjects design. So this is a study we're doing in the Hank lab right now, looking at how bicyclists and cars interact with protected versus unprotected bike lanes. So half of our participants are riding in the scenario on the left where they have an unprotected bike lane, and half of the participants are riding in the scenario on the right where they're riding in a protected bike lane. So another type of factor that you can use in an experiment is a within subjects factor. And that is a factor that's manipulated within the same group of subjects. So here, unlike a between subjects design, you have a single sample of participants that serves in every condition. And here again, you need at least 2 levels for each factor, but it can be more. A within subjects design tends to increase your statistical power because subjects serve as their own controls. So if you wanted to do a study where, maybe this isn't a great example, but if you did want to do your drowsy driving study within subjects, you could have the same group of subjects drive one time as drowsy and drive another time as non-drowsy. And so in that case, you're using the same set of participants in both of those conditions, and they serve as their own controls because you're comparing their performance across the 2 conditions. But here, as we'll talk about in much more detail later, you really need to control for order effects. So if you did want to use a within subjects design to look at this drowsiness, you would most definitely want to have half of your participants do the drowsy driving first, and then the non-drowsy driving, and the other half do the non-drowsy driving first and the drowsy driving second. This kind of design you might also be familiar with as a repeated measures or as a within subjects design. All of that would be the same. Mixed designs include both within and between subjects factors, so that's fine, and we often do studies where we have a between groups kind of condition where we have separate groups of people participating, and then each of those groups also does, say, 2 different tasks or something like that. So you have a within subjects condition as well, or a within subjects factor. Here's an example of a study we've done in the Hank lab where we're looking at how people respond to adaptive versus non-adaptive or traditional headlamps. So they're crossing a road. In the left-hand panel, it shows a car that has traditional headlamps, and in the right-hand panel, it shows a car that has these adaptive headlamps that shine a warning sort of icon in front of the pedestrian when the car gets too close. And so this is a within subjects design because participants see both types of cars, and we're just looking to see, are they more likely to cross in front of the traditional headlamps than in front of the adaptive headlamps. So the other side of this are your dependent variables. So the dependent variables are the responses that you're measuring. And so you need to ask here, what responses do you want to measure to address your question? So looking at appropriate responses is going to be very critical for addressing your research questions. So these could be things like lane keeping, response time, so how quickly do they react to something that incurs into the roadway, looking behavior, if you're doing eye tracking. One thing here that you need to keep in mind is that your responses must be operationalized. Sometimes that's easy, so if it's did they crash or not crash, you can pretty much tell what's going to be a crash and what's not a crash. But something like lane keeping can be a little bit more tricky. So you need to think about what's the definition of lane keeping. How far out of the lane or close to the edge of the lane can they be in order to be said to still be in the lane, or there you could actually measure sort of their continuous position as they're driving as well. Another thing to consider when you're thinking about dependent variables or response variables is the sampling rate of these variables, which just means kind of how often you're able to collect these responses. So if you're talking about crashes, typically in a drive, you don't want people to crash more than once. And so that is going to be a very low rate of sampling, meaning that you get one crash. But if you're looking at something like reaction time, this is something that you could measure continuously throughout the drive or in response to specific events that happen, and those types of events could happen with relative frequency, and that would allow you to have a much higher sampling rate for something like reaction time or looking time. So the sampling rate of your dependent variables will impact the statistical power and implications that can be drawn. So the rule of thumb here is that the more samples you have of your dependent variable, the more stable that measure is going to be, and you'll have less variability. This will give you more statistical power in your experiment. So this is something that you want to think about when you're designing an experiment. If you're going to have a one-time thing like crash or no crash, you're definitely going to need a lot more subjects than if you're measuring something that can be repeatedly measured throughout the drive and create a lot of observations for your experiment. You also want to think about generalization to real-world phenomena. So is the effect meaningful in the real world? So in thinking about your response variables, you do want to think about things that we might care about in the real world, since typically people are doing simulation studies in order to make some inferences about risk factors in the real world or how people might behave in the real world. Another thing people might want to consider is whether there are dependencies among the measures. This is not necessarily a problem, but it's good to know ahead of time. So for example, in our work on road crossing, where we're looking at how kids and adults are crossing through gaps in continuous traffic, their timing of entry into a gap will typically be correlated with the time to spare when they're exiting the gap, because how quickly you cut in behind the lead vehicle in the gap will partially determine how much time to spare you have with the tail vehicle in the gap when you exit the roadway. And so for us, it's just been useful to kind of keep in mind that there are some things that are going to be correlated in the data in terms of making our interpretations. So a third step in thinking about designing your experiment is thinking about whether you need a control condition. So a control condition is where everything is exactly the same as the experimental condition except for the manipulated variable. And so this is sort of a very basic part of experimental design, where you want to isolate all of the extraneous variants in a situation so that the only thing that's different between your experimental condition and a control condition is what you're manipulating. So this kind of measure, or this kind of control, is typically only used with between subjects or mixed designs. So if you have a between subject factor and one of the levels of that factor involves manipulating an experience, you might need a control condition where that experience is not manipulated, just to serve as a comparison base. So these kinds of control conditions are useful when you want to see business as usual performance. So how people might perform without any kind of manipulation or special experience. You might want to see, for example, how people control their speed when they're in a regular car versus one that has some kind of automatic adaptive cruise control, something like that. Your control condition would be how people are driving without that kind of aid. Another way that you can think about controls and countermeasures is measuring baseline performance. So baseline performance is a measure of performance prior to any manipulated variable. So this is almost always done at the beginning of an experiment, which is kind of why we call it baseline, because you're looking at what people are doing prior to anything special that might be happening in the experiment. This is typically only used with within subject designs, where people might be doing some repeated tasks or doing multiple tasks within the same group of subjects. So it's very useful in what we might call these kind of ABA design experiments, or where you have a pretest, an intervention, and then a post-test. So having the pretest, that's essentially your baseline, and that allows you to know, if you compare the pretest and post-test, it allows you to know whether the intervention had an effect. These kinds of experiments might also even include another kind of control where you would not have an intervention, but you would still have a pretest, a control, non-intervention, and a post-test. All of that kind of design can be used to make sure that you know how things are changing as a result of your manipulated variable.
You did get a question there, Jody. I think you answered it, though. It came in right before the baseline. You described baseline.
Okay, so Thomas, did that make sense to you, the difference between sort of a baseline and a control condition? Okay. I think they are very similar. It's just we tend to think of control condition as being more of a between subjects type of measure, and the baseline more for within subjects. Okay, somebody else is typing. We'll wait until we get this. Okay, I'll just, okay. No need for baseline measures between subjects. It depends. So that last example that I gave where, I'll just put this in more concrete terms. So here at NADS, we're conducting a study of novice driver training, and we're evaluating hazard anticipation training programs for novice drivers. And so in this study, it is an ABA type design where, well, it's more a pre-test, post-test design. So we have a pre-test drive before they get the training, and then they have a post-test drive after they've had the training and have then had some experience, like a few weeks driving on their own out there in the real world. But we also have a control condition where the teens come in and they do a pre-test drive, which is the baseline. They don't do any training. They get sent away for a few weeks, and then they come in and do a post-test drive as well. So there, we actually are combining baseline measures as well as control measures, because we have an experimental group, which is the group that's getting the training, the hazard anticipation training. We have a control group that's not getting the training, but we're also looking at baseline for both of those groups so that we can compare their performance at post-test to baseline to see if there's been change in their performance. And that's important because it could be that kids are just getting better as they're getting more experience, and it has nothing to do with the training, hazard anticipation training at all. And so for that reason, we want a control condition just to look at, are kids getting better just as they get more experience rather than through the training. Okay, that was kind of a long answer and example. Does that help in thinking about baseline and control? All right, great. Okay, so talking a little bit about controlling for order effects. So this is something that people really need to be aware of in designing experiments, because order effects are a serious confound in experimental design. So everybody should probably understand that people's behavior changes with repeated testing, either getting better or sometimes it gets worse as they get tired or fatigued. And so if the order of presentation of a task is confounded with a manipulated variable, you won't be able to disentangle the two in assigning causation. So you really want to pay attention to order effects. Like I was talking about earlier, if you want to look at drowsy versus non-drowsy driving and you want to use a within subjects design, you can't have everybody do drowsy driving first and then do non-drowsy driving another day. Because the problem is that when they come in to do the non-drowsy driving the second day, they've already had now experience in the simulator. So you're not going to be able to tell, is their performance different in the non-drowsy condition because they're non-drowsy or because they've had experience in the simulator and they're better at driving in the simulator. So these are the kinds of examples of things that you want to think about that have to do with order. So how do we control for order effects? One way is just to randomize the order of events. So examples here might be if people are in a driving simulator and they're encountering several kinds of hazards that occur along the drive, you don't want to have those hazards all come in the same order for every subject. There you would probably really want to randomize the order that different subjects are seeing those hazards, just to make sure that there isn't something about seeing hazard 1 that will impact how they respond to hazard 2 and 3 and so on. In experimental designs, you can also control for order effects by using complete factorial designs or incomplete factorial designs, which are Latin squares. So in a complete factorial design, say in a between subjects design, all levels are going to be completely crossed with each other. So all conditions will be completely crossed with each other. So this only works if you have a small number of conditions, because you might, otherwise you're going to need a very large N to deal with this. So if you wanted to look at, let me think of an example. So if you had 2 driving tasks that you wanted people to do, and there, of course, then would be 2 orders. You could do this in a between subjects design if you had one group that did task 1 first and another group that did task 1 second, and then you had another group that did task 2 first and another group that did task 2 second. So if you think about that as like sort of a little 2x2 matrix, you can see how all of those task and order are completely crossed with each other. And again, that's going to require a very large N because each factor is going to require a doubling of the N. In a within subjects design, participants would see each possible sequence or complete each task, and there you would need to counterbalance or randomize order So as we were talking about with the drowsy driving, you definitely want to counterbalance the order that people do the drowsy and non-drowsy driving. If you do it all in a single session where they're doing 2 tasks and you're then counterbalancing the order of those 2 tasks, you do need to think about the length of the session, whether people can actually handle doing both of those tasks in order to deal with the order effect in a single session. So incomplete factorial designs is where participants see some but not all of the possible sequences of the events or the tasks. This is a Latin square kind of design where every condition follows every other condition the same number of times. So this is just one example of a Latin square design here on the slide. There are other ways that you can do this that are more complicated, and if you're interested in that, you can easily Google Latin square designs and you'll see different options for how you might create a Latin square table.
Jody, there was a question about what constitutes a large N.
Oh, okay. Thank you. It's good that John is here and helping me see the questions. I'm so focused on these slides. Okay, so the question is, what constitutes a large N in driving simulator studies? So that is an excellent question, and has to do with statistical power and sample size. It will depend on how precise your measurements are, but typically when we do between subjects designs, in every between subjects cell of the design, we're having at least 20 participants. Probably better to even have it closer to 25 if you're doing power analyses ahead of time. And I think that there's quite a bit of variation in driving simulator studies in terms of the sample size that people use. But I know in my field, which is psychology, they are becoming, journals are becoming more and more concerned about underpowered studies where you really don't have the sample size needed to actually detect a significant effect that's there. I don't know, John, if you had anything to add to that.
No, I think that's a good answer. I think in our field, it's not uncommon to see really underpowered studies, like 8 subjects per cell, which I think is probably vastly underpowered.
Right, so it's not uncommon to see like eight subjects per cell in a driving simulator study, but that would be vastly underpowered in actuality in terms of statistical analyses. Does that help? Okay, great. But that is a good question, and I think it's an issue that the driving simulation field is probably going to be increasingly grappling with in the future. And sample size is tough because the more participants you need, the more expensive it is to run a study, and it takes more time. You have to recruit those participants. So I think all of us sort of reluctantly, in a way, increase the N in our samples due to these pressures from journals and so on, just because of those considerations. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about samples and generalizability. So when you're designing your experiment, you really want to think about the population that you want to study. So populations could be community samples, so you're just recruiting regular people from the community, say adults who are drivers, anywhere between the ages of 20 and 60 or something like that. Your population could be college students. So for sure in my field of psychology, college students are really the go-to sample because they're so convenient and easy to recruit. So people sometimes have only college students in their studies. You might also be interested in looking at special populations such as children, older adults, patient populations. For all of these, you really need to think about who you want to generalize to in terms of the results of your study. So if you only want to really generalize to college students or young adults, then maybe it's okay to just use college students in your study. But if you really want to say something about drivers more in general, then you may well want to recruit samples that include a much broader range of ages and experience with driving. I think I mentioned this before, but it's very important to have a random selection or assignment of participants within your groups for any kind of between subjects conditions, because we want to make sure that we're not introducing extraneous variance that has to do with the particular participants that ended up in one group versus another group. Let's see, we have another question here. Can we get a link to this presentation for future reference? This is really good information that will help with my experimental setup. Yes, definitely. We are recording, and we will also provide links to people after the webinar. We decided that we wanted to wait until after each webinar to make the links available so that people didn't just like not attend the webinar. So we will make that available to you. Another important issue with samples, as we've kind of been talking about, is power and sample size. So statistical power is directly related to your sample size. So many journals now are requiring investigators to do a priori power analyses that use effect sizes from similar studies in order to determine what your sample size needs to be. A typical rule of thumb is looking for a power of 0.80 and what kind of sample size you would need given the effect sizes that similar studies might have seen. So in order to do this, sometimes you can work from your own previous research to show what kinds of effect sizes you typically get. Or sometimes you may need to go to the literature and look at what are the general effect sizes that people see in similar studies. You can use freely available online software like GPower to calculate, do these a priori power analyses, and this is very useful. They have tutorials online as well for how to use those kinds of programs. Sample size also depends, as we've been talking about, on the number of between and within subjects factors. So especially your between subjects factors are going to drastically influence your sample size. Type 1 and type 2 error are very important when considering sample size. So a type 1 error is where you essentially falsely conclude that an effect exists, and sometimes this can happen because your sample size is too small and there are extraneous sources of variation and it looks like you have an effect but you really don't have an effect. That would be a type 1 error. A type 2 error would be falsely concluding that an effect does not exist. And this can also be a problem if your sample size is too small, because essentially you don't have the statistical power to detect a difference that is really there. So that, you know, you've manipulated some variable and you're concluding that there's no difference between these two conditions, but there actually is a difference, but you can't detect it with only 8 subjects in each of those groups. Okay, now we're on to step 5, and so I'm going to turn this over to John Gasper, and he'll finish up with the webinar.
All right, thank you, Jody. I'm going to apologize in advance. My voice is a little scratchy, as you can probably tell. So if anybody has trouble hearing, just feel free to type in the chat window and I'll try to speak up. So I'm going to talk about a few other
experimental design issues, and then really I'll kind of focus mostly on kind of how we integrate these principles of experimental design that Jody covered into the context of simulator experiments specifically. So step 5 here, the idea is really to get at other issues that could influence your results and try to resolve those issues prior to beginning to collect any data. So in the design process, you can kind of account for some of the potential pitfalls through good experimental design. So one of those factors is other potential confounds, and really the value of simulation, as we talked about last week and Jody mentioned again earlier in the presentation. One of the really strong advantages is in our degree of experimental control. So in order to maintain that degree of experimental control, it's really important that we try to control for everything that isn't related to the variables that we're manipulating. So these can be things as simple as age and gender. It can be things like driving experience, the type of vehicle that someone owns and the technology that's on that vehicle. And really it's important to kind of consider other factors that might influence your results and think about ways to control for those things. In designing experiments, it's also important to consider both floor and ceiling effects and to try to limit the potential for both of those. And these just refer to kind of a high proportion of participants in your study kind of reaching the max or minimum value. So a good example of this might be a study where you wanted to look at driver response time, say in a takeover from automation. But if you design an event such that everyone crashes before they can even start responding, you're not going to get any information about response time and response behavior. So the idea here is that you need to kind of design events that are challenging enough to elicit differences between your groups if there are differences that exist, but not so challenging that you kind of mask those differences. I think Jody did a really nice job covering some of the challenges with kind of including too many factors. As she mentioned, these experimental designs can kind of balloon as you try to include many different factors. And I think given the cost of simulation, we try sometimes to kind of jam in as many different experimental factors as we can. And the potential pitfall there is that by having so many factors, you limit your sample size, and that limits the interpretability of your results. And you also end up with some of these higher order interactions that are really difficult to interpret. And finally, I think it probably can't be stressed enough that in designing experiments, it's really, really important to think about how you're going to analyze your data. And I'll speak to kind of how we design events, and I know the next webinar will cover that in much more detail. But in designing these events and these experiments more broadly, it's very important to think about being able to extract relevant measures from those data. Okay, so I'll start by kind of covering potential ways to kind of counteract irrelevant variables or other variables that we don't want to consider as part of our design. So these, like, again, can be things like age and gender, or more specific things like driving experience, exposure to certain vehicle technologies. And again, the goal here is to kind of account for these things through experimental design. So, for example, let's consider a study where we want to look at the effects of different types of music on driving experience. So to fit that within Jody's description earlier, our independent variable in this case is the type of music, either fast or slow. And our dependent measure is some aspect of driving performance. So for simplicity's sake, let's just say speed. But we can get into a situation where other factors such as age kind of create additional variability within our sample. So if we know that different age groups are going to respond to music differently, that can create a confound that again, kind of makes it difficult to interpret the effects of the music speed independent variable that we're interested in. So one way to account for this is to balance our conditions across the irrelevant variable, in this case, across age. So you can see this matrix here where we kind of account for, we have a certain number of younger adults and older adults in each of our two music conditions. And that can help kind of control for those other variables. Okay, so I'm going to talk for the next few slides, really I think the rest of the webinar here, about some of the unique challenges of kind of taking this experimental design into the context of simulation. And I think there's some unique aspects about simulation, unique aspects in terms of how we have to think about experimental design. And I think there's two kind of stages of this. One is thinking about the specific events that we want to include. So the specific, say, response time events that we want to include within an experiment. But then simulation is kind of unique in that we also have to kind of couch those events within the context of a larger drive. Because we do want behavior in these experiments to be the best reflection of kind of natural driving behavior as we could get. It's really important that we get people kind of comfortable with the simulator and with the vehicle and with the tasks that they're doing before they encounter some sort of event. So events, again, I'm referring to events as kind of the specific thing that happens within the context of a larger drive. So this, for instance, could be a driver responding to a pedestrian crossing the street, a driver reacting to a lead vehicle reveal sort of event. But this is really kind of the situation that we want to measure some sort of behavior, some sort of response. We can do this in a repeated way, so you can have multiple events throughout the drive. As Jody mentioned, there's kind of benefits and drawbacks to doing that. The benefits being that you get kind of multiple glances into someone's behavior. The potential drawback being that as soon as someone sees one event, that kind of changes their subsequent behavior. So again, balancing the order of those events becomes really important. For things where we think behavior is really going to change if people see more than one event, we can just kind of include a single event within a drive. So those could be like really crash imminent situations where we think as soon as someone sees that, that's going to change how they would behave throughout the rest of the experiment. So we just give them one event. Again, that kind of necessitates a between subjects design, which leads to more subjects. So there's the kind of challenges that need to be addressed, kind of compromises to work out, I guess trade-offs to work out in deciding how many events and what type of events to include in a particular drive. Again, the second part of this is that those events need to be integrated into a larger drive. And the goal, again, is to kind of get people into a natural driving state before you kind of spring these events on them. Simulator sickness is also a concern. So as we have people drive for longer periods of time, and we have them do things that we know increase sickness, like turning or kind of sudden stop and goes, a lot of those, that increases the chances that we're going to see simulator sickness. And I'll talk about some ways that we can try to reduce that. Okay, so when we're talking about scripting events, there's really three parts, and I think Dawn, I believe, will cover this in the next webinar in greater detail, but at a pretty high level, there's three parts. So there's a trigger for the event, something that causes the event to happen. There's the event behavior. You can think of this as kind of the behavior or the response window, so where we're looking for a response from the participant. And then there's something that ends that event, so something that marks the end of a certain situation. So that could be something, in this case, like the vehicle pulling around this stopped vehicle, giving the driver a certain amount of time to respond. So we're looking for a response kind of before the driver gets to this vehicle or before the driver passes this stopped vehicle. Again, the next step is really to take that event and to put it into a larger drive. So the way our simulator drives often work here is we give people some sort of training or screening drive at the beginning, and that can be something that lasts up to 15 minutes. And the idea there is twofold. One is to give people time to kind of acclimate to the simulator. The other portion of that is to act as a screen for simulator sickness. So we usually see within the first 15 minutes, if people are going to show signs of sim sickness, those signs usually pop up within that first set. So before we get someone and have them drive for an hour or 2 hours in the simulator, we can kind of screen out those individuals who are prone to sim sickness. So after we've done that, what we'll typically do is we'll have people drive along some sort of route. And those routes will happen within, we have pretty large networks of virtual roads. So we'll create a route within this larger road network. And then within that route, we'll place our events. So really the challenge comes in understanding A, what that route should look like, and then B, where those events should be placed within that route. Nope. Okay. So in considering kind of the driving experiment as a whole, there's other aspects that we need to consider when we're kind of planning out that route and thinking about where events should fall within that route. So Jody mentioned space considerations and fatigue earlier. So space being the, like in a pedestrian simulator, how much room people have to walk. Fatigue being the number of times you can make someone do something before you start to see them get tired. And again, unless we're trying to measure fatigue, fatigue becomes kind of another confounding variable that we don't necessarily want to have to account for. So good experimental design kind of takes that into consideration. Usually we won't have people drive for more than about an hour because of that. We don't want people to get just tired of driving or drowsy during their drives. So scenario types, this refers to kind of the nature of the different events within a drive. So again, there's value in having repeated events if we don't think the repeated events are going to have a huge impact on subsequent events. So Jody's shown some examples, and I think Joe showed some last week, of pedestrian experiments where someone's repeatedly crossing a road. For kind of non-crash imminent events, that makes sense in the driving simulator context as well. So this could be something like cars passing a bike list in a number of situations. We can also kind of do, because we have experimental control in the simulator environment, we can do things like adapt the scenarios to the behavior of participants. So a good example of this is distraction work that we've done in the past, where we've used our eye tracker to kind of tell us when someone's engaged with a secondary task. So we'll have them say, look down at their cell phone. And what we can do is we can use that eye tracking data in real time to kind of cue an event so that we know that the event's happening when someone's looking away from the road, which is kind of a mean thing to do, but also a higher level of experimental control than you could get even on a test track. And again, in designing these events, we really need to kind of consider making them kind of the right degree of challenging. This is kind of the Goldilocks situation where the event needs to be challenging enough to elicit differences between the conditions, but not so challenging that it just kind of overwhelms people. So in wrapping up here, really it's one thing to kind of say all of those things, like make the event challenging enough, but really what that entails is a lot of pilot testing. And pilot testing is probably one of the most important pieces of all the simulator work that we do. So it's really important. I think we've had many instances where the researchers have driven scenarios hundreds of times only to get our first pilot subjects in there and have them do something completely different, something completely unexpected. So it's really important to get pilot subjects into your simulator, into your scenario, to see how they behave and to make sure that all of your events and your drive as a whole is kind of functioning the way that you expect it to. The other benefit of pilot testing is that you're able to kind of get a glimpse into your data and kind of do some checks on your data to make sure that things are functioning. And that serves two purposes. One is to make sure that your events are triggering in the way that you want them to. So if you know that an event's supposed to trigger at a certain time headway, for instance, you can go back and you can precisely check to make sure that that's happening. The other obvious benefit of that pilot testing is to make sure that you're collecting all of the measures that you're intending to, so that you can generate the correct response variables. So I think that's it. We have some suggested activities that kind of grew out of a webinar that Jody and Shannon Roberts from UMass had put on. So I might encourage folks who are listening who haven't gone through the process of creating a simulator experiment to kind of work through some of the questions that we've outlined here. So we are happy to answer additional questions. I think we have a little bit of time.
Point about pilot testing and checking your data before you actually start running your real experiment. I can't stress how important that is. It's one of the things that it's like a high priority thing to do, but it's hard to make yourself do it. And we have had, really disastrous things happen in the past where we thought that the order of the gap sizes was randomized for every child at every intersection, and we ran over 100 kids, and then when we looked back at the data, it turned out that every child was getting the same order of gaps at every intersection, which is, essentially almost making those data unpublishable. And so through bad and hard experiences like that, we've learned that no matter how painful it is and how anxious you are to start running your experiment, you really should look at the data and make sure that, like John said, the scenario is running the way you think it is, and that you're actually collecting the measures that you want to have in the end. Okay, Arun is typing here. Let's see. Are there certain rules or precautions or effects that would apply or should be accounted for in pilots other than what is already discussed here?
I would say our practice with our pilot subjects is to treat them as close to normal participants as we absolutely can. I think that's our general rule.
So one of the things that we also use pilot testing for is to make sure that all of the people who are running the experiment are on the same page so that they're actually following the procedure correctly, because that can be another terrible source of unwanted variance in your study, is that if you have experimenters basically doing things differently, that's going to create a huge problem. And so pilot testing is another place where we do a lot of training of our experimenters to make sure they're all doing everything correctly.
Another, to kind of add on that point, I think it's also very important that the pilot participants that you use are people who are unfamiliar with the study that you're trying to run. I think so often we run some member of the research team through who knows what the manipulation is, and you just never, even if they're trying their best to act normal, you're never going to get the response that you'll get from real subjects.
Yeah, that's true. Often we'll do things in different phases, like when we're just trying to get something up and running, we might have other people in the lab run it through because everything's so rough that we don't want to bring in other people. But John is definitely right that before you start running the real study, you're going to want to bring in pilot subjects who are totally naive and unfamiliar with the virtual environments or the tasks and so on.
Mhm.
So another question is, what is the N you would recommend for a pilot study before analyzing that pilot data? That really depends a lot on how close what you're doing is to something that you've run in the past. Things that are very similar to stuff that you've run in the past will need a lot fewer pilot subjects. Like we might even run just a handful, like maybe 4 or 5, and check the data that everything's running as it's supposed to be, that the procedure seems like it works fine. But then there are other studies where it's something totally new, it's exploratory, and boy, you can go through a lot of pilot subjects, and sometimes it's a stepwise procedure of modifying and improving things as you go along. Like you might run 3 or 4, realize something doesn't work very well, fix it, run another 3 or 4, see how that works until you get to a place where you feel really comfortable.
Mhm. Yeah, it's almost always an incremental process. At least for us, it's almost always an incremental process.
Yeah. So these days, most of the human-machine interface evaluations are conducted in a simulator. Would that affect the type of simulator used, say low fidelity or high fidelity simulators?
Yeah, so I think really the choice in simulator, if you do have a choice in simulator, which many of us are kind of confined to the simulators that we do have, I think you need to consider what the research question is and then whether it can be accurately addressed by the type of simulator. So, for instance, if you're looking at a study where motion cues are really important, then you're really going to need a simulator that has high fidelity motion cues. So I think it really just depends on the question that you're trying to address. And I think it's important to try to avoid just forcing a research question into a simulator. I think that's where people run into problems.
So what is the age range considered as older age found in the literature? So that's answered here in the chat, 65 years of age or older. So 65 is usually a good cutoff number because that's general age at which people can start to retire, and so but it can clearly go up, to people who are 80, 85 or so on. And another question is, what is a higher order interaction? Any example? Okay, so I would say 2-way interactions, 3-way interactions are probably okay. You can interpret those. But when I review papers in the literature, when I'm asked to review papers where you're starting to get into 4- and 5-way interactions, those become very, very difficult to interpret because you have to break down those interactions, and it's essentially saying to you that the patterns of responses are differing across different kinds of combinations of your conditions. And nailing down exactly what those different combinations that result in different patterns are can be really hard when you get up into 4- and 5-way interactions. And those are things where people are putting in stuff like, okay, we've got age as a variable, and we've got vehicle type as a variable. Is it a car or is it a truck? You've got distance from the roadway as a variable, and you've got speed of the car coming as a variable. And at the beginning, when someone's designing the experiment, it might seem like, oh yeah, we want to look at all of those things. And so they put them all into the experiment, and then they get a 4-way interaction between all those variables, and then it's like, oh no, now I have to figure out what that means. And so that's why it can sometimes just be a little bit better to pick out the variables that are really important to you and not try to jam everything into the experiment. All right, anything else that people have questions about? We have some more typing here, I guess. We're happy to stay here if people have some more questions that they want to ask. Okay, here's another one. As you mentioned, usual driving time per subject is around an hour. That short term might have an effect on their expectation that something can happen. Any thoughts on that?
So I think there's always, I would probably argue with any simulator experiment, there's always going to be an expectation that something's going to happen. I think people come here with the expectation that we're doing this in a simulator for a reason. I think what we try to do is we try to make that as unpredictable as possible, and we try to kind of make the lead into that unpredictable event as natural as possible. So we try to allow people enough time to where their driving, we think, is a pretty good reflection of what their driving would look like during normal periods out on the road. And then we try to build these events such that people can't easily predict when that event's going to occur, but also that that event happens in a context where it would actually happen in the real road. So any of these experiments is really kind of a trade-off among these different factors, and there's a lot of, I think, additional things to consider that go into kind of making the story of this driving experiment, or this simulator experiment.
And in our studies with the bicycling and pedestrian work, you know, we're often using repeated tasks. So it's like you're going to cross the road 20 times while you're texting on a cell phone and watching this traffic and trying to go across. And so people will know, of course, that you're studying that how does texting affect the way that people cross roads. But what we're comparing is, say, how people who are texting and crossing roads differ from people who are not texting, or who might differ from people who are texting and we're giving them warnings or alerts on their phone about when a safe or unsafe gap is about to arrive at the intersection. And my experience is that even though people might know that you're looking at some behavior, they actually, over the course of the experiment, just try to do the task as well as they can. And so, in a way, the fact that they know what you're looking at, I'm not sure that that actually creates a problem, especially when you're comparing between these conditions and people are just, they're just trying to do the task that you're giving them.
Another way, just to briefly mention it, that we can get at expectation is through the instructions that we give people before they enter the simulator. So oftentimes we'll give people kind of an abbreviated set of instruction, of like description of what they're going to do, or we'll tell people that they're here for something that they're not really here for. So a good example of that, we did some work on unintended acceleration that happened as people were doing this parking maneuver. And that happened at the very end of a drive that we had, where we told people what our goal was to understand how they interact with a potentially distracting task. So the idea was that we would have people do this drive, they'd get comfortable, they think they were doing this other task, and at the very end we kind of spring this other event on them. And then obviously we provide debriefing at the end so that people understand why we did what we did.
Yep. Any other questions people might have? So as we mentioned, we're going to make sure that the recording and the slides are available to people if they want to look back at it. Okay, Thomas is still typing, I think, a little bit here. Letting subjects crash in simulations, did you ever run into ethical approval issues?
No, I think we have not. The crashes in our simulator aren't I mean, they don't look like real crashes. I mean, you just kind of go through certain objects and we record that a crash occurred.
But do people sometimes like slam on the brakes and stuff?
Yeah, people get, I mean, they're kind of shocked by those events. I think that initial reaction is similar to what it would be in the real world.
Yeah.
But we've never run into, I guess, IRB issues or anything with that.
It's always important, and it is going to be part of your IRB approval, is that you always tell people that they can stop the experiment or the drive at any time and won't be penalized. And so, of course, that doesn't help if they've had a crash and then feel traumatized about it. But the other thing that we do is we always debrief participants at the end of the experiment. So, you know, if somebody did have a crash, we would talk to them about the crash and kind of what we're interested in studying and things like that. Make sure that they feel fine about the whole situation.
Yeah, and on the front end, we generally give people at least a pretty decent overview of what they're going to be doing during the task. So I think understanding that crashes are a potential, just as they would be if you were really driving, I think we try to let people kind of understand what it's going to be like as much as possible up front.
Yeah. Anything else people have questions about? And also, you know, please feel free to email us anytime if you wanted to run something by us or ask another question that you thought of later. Okay, one more typing here. Where is the recording going to be? Dawn?
I'll let Dawn chime in on that if she's still on.
Dawn, can you type out something if you're there? She's logged on, but I'm not sure she heard this. Okay, Bertrand is typing. For last session, it was sent by email.
Yeah, I believe it'll initially be sent by email to everyone who registered for the webinar.
Yeah, so everybody who registered for today will get an email with a link to the presentation. Yep. And then I assume we'll probably put these on the website at some point.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Okay, anything else anybody has? Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Hope this was useful and hope to have you back next week for webinar 3. All right, bye-bye.